Welcome to Searching the Sacred. We are in this delicious and rich and sometimes difficult series where we are exploring women that exist in multiple faith traditions and hearing about them from the texts in different traditions, and then having this expansive multi-faith conversation about how we grew up seeing that woman and how we see that woman now and how we learn about her more from one another. So today we are talking about Hagar or Hajar. And we are going to, as we often do in Searching the Sacred, we're going to start by reading the text. And so we're going to read that in the Muslim and the Jewish and the Christian tradition. And then we are going to go back around and introduce ourselves to you. So let's begin with Fosia.
So the verse that I am going to read, it's in a chapter of the Quran called Surah Al-Baqarah. It's verse 158. And it refers to the Safa and Marwa mountains, which are in Mecca. And because Hajar ran between those two mountains when she was looking for water for Ismail alayhi salam, so it has a huge significance in our religion. Indeed, the hills of Safa and Marwa are among the symbols of Allah. So whoever makes a major or minor pilgrim to the sacred house, let them walk between the two hills. And whoever does good willingly, Allah is truly appreciative, all-knowing.
So I am reading from Genesis, or in Hebrew we call it Bereshit, chapter 21, starting with verse 9. And I think today I'm going to chant this in the High Holiday trope. We read this passage on the Jewish New Year, on Rosh Hashanah, and we use a special melody for it. So I'll chant it in that melody. ותרא שרה את בן הגר המצרית אשר ילדה לאברהם מצחק ותאמר לאברהם גרש המה הזאת ואת בנה כי לא יירש בן המה הזאת עם בני עם יצחק. Sarah saw the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham, playing. She said to Abraham, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly, for it concerned a son of his. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that your offspring shall be continued. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him too, for he is your seed."
I'm going to read from Galatians 4:22 through 24, and then 28 to 30. It's written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and one by the free woman. The son by the slave woman was conceived the normal way, but the son by the free woman was conceived through a promise. These things are an allegory. The women are two covenants. Brothers and sisters, you are the children of the promise like Isaac. But just as it was then, so it is now also. The one who was conceived the normal way harassed the one who was conceived by the Spirit. But what does the scripture say? Throw out the slave woman and her son, because the slave woman's son won't share the inheritance with the free woman's son.
I feel like I need to invite deep breaths before we keep going. I think, as has been happening, there's a lot of questions already popping up just from those different readings, but we are going to start by introducing ourselves. So if you would share your name, the faith tradition that you come from, and if you have a role in that tradition you would like to share. And then what, if anything, you grew up learning about or hearing about this woman, Hajar, that we are talking about today. So Fosia, would you begin?
Assalamu alaikum, greeting of peace. I am Fosia. I am a graduate of Rabata, which is a women's learning institution It is an online platform. It is for women, by women. I also teach women at a local mosque, and I also teach teen classes for the Rabata Institute. Hajar is a very prominent figure in our faith tradition, and growing up, hear the story of how she is left at the desert by Ibrahim alayhi salam, and then her baby Ismail um, is left with her, and she runs between these two hills looking for water, and then and at that time it's just like, okay, doesn't none of it makes sense. Like, this woman is left and there's a baby involved. Okay, so what's going on here? But it wasn't until much later that you try to understand the implications about her certainty, her faith, her complete trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Thank you.
I am Tamar Magill-Grimm. I am the Senior Rabbi at Beth Jacob Congregation, which is in Mendota Heights, Minnesota. And I received my Rabbinic Ordination from the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College, which is in Boston. I would say learning this story, early on, I was taught the story through the lens of midrash, of rabbinic, interpretation of the story. And so kind of the slant on it was, Hagar and Ishmael are not, they're not our ancestors. They're not the important people in the story. They're sort of can't think of the word I'm looking for. But anyway, so they're not like the most important people in the story. And later, Ishmael is seen as in an unfavorable light. And so really it's all about, well, how do we get to Isaac as the inheritor of Abraham's as the inheritor and as like of Abraham's faith and as our as our forefather.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
My name is Rachel Pye Jones, and I am a Christian. I have a master's degree of theology and a master's in intercultural studies, and I'm currently a PhD student in intercultural studies with a focus on Islamic studies. So that's where my interest in these interreligious conversations really lies. But that interest comes out of 20 years of living abroad in the Horn of Africa, immersed as a Christian in Muslim majority communities. And so it's interesting to think about Hagar, because I grew up not really thinking a whole lot about her, but thinking about the implications from her. Or Ishmael, her son, sort of was seen as the ancestor of Islam and Muslims, and that was kind of framed as an enemy, to use a very fraught, loaded term. And so her story became kind of like a foil for division and animosity. It was never really like spoken that. It was just sort of kind of a rap, like the feeling, I guess, which makes me very uncomfortable to say that now when I've reinterpreted her story through actually reading it, and Ishmael's story in Genesis in a different way. But then even now, like reading it from the New Testament, I'm realizing through these conversations on the podcast that I've been reigniting, I guess, my Christian faith in recent years. And a key factor in that reigniting and re-excitement about my faith and the scriptures has been reading the Hebrew women's stories through the Hebrew scriptures. Again, like going back to the Old Testament, because of questions that were raised through my interactions with Muslims and learning about these women in the Quran. And so there's a way in which what I learned from reading the Quran and Muslims made me want to read the stories of the Hebrew scriptures of these women again that I had already mostly interpreted through the New Testament. And so right there for me, there's this fascinating interplay of the three faiths for my own growth and re-interest in and re-love for my Christian tradition, because of how the Hebrew scriptures and the Quranic traditions kind of flesh out and temper some of the stuff that comes up in the New Testament. So that's where I'm coming at this story, or the angle I'm coming from with.
Thank you.
I'm Lisa. I co-host this podcast. I co-lead 40 Orchards with Steph. I spend half my time working with folks who are incarcerated or coming out of incarceration, and hopefully gain insight from them to bring back to those of us who are not behind bars. I just feel like I'm going to say it. So here's the thing. I really don't think I had any conversations about Hagar in my entire, I don't think she even crossed my mind. And I will say that I think that's partly because she is framed as a maidservant. And in my mind, when I grew up, that was just an immediate bypass. There wasn't a way, and I would say that was true through my entire time, up until my 40s. That's not that long ago. And it is long ago. I'm not there anymore. But this is where I get a little sweaty, because I think there's a particular level of racism and privilege that comes from not having to ask questions or wrestle with things. And it really wasn't until I would say that when I really got curious and things shifted for me is after reading the Reverend Dr. Wilda Gaffney's book, and really starting to wrestle with actually what the story was doing and the things that I claimed to be passionate about, but actually missed in the text of a tradition that I should have got.
Just to name the title, that book is called Womanist Midrash, by Dr. Wilda Gaffney. It's particularly just focused on the Torah, correct? Like the first.
Yeah. Her first book is.
So I'm Steph. I co-lead with Lisa, as she named, and in the Christian tradition that I grew up with, I don't know that we ever talked about Hagar. But then in the evangelical church I was a part of, I recall some conversations where it was really framing her as more of the example of Abraham's lack of faith as compared to something that was good or a blessing. It was sort of this framing of, oh, this is the story and the implications when humans took matters into their own hands, which I think probably comes from that Galatians passage that you read that sort of has that same sort of foil to it. And so I think that this is a good moment to name. I think we've done this in most episodes, but we'll do this again right here and right now. All of us are humans representing ourselves. We are not representing the entirety of our faith tradition and what our faith tradition would believe about a person. That's not fair to ask of any faith tradition. And we also will do our best here to be as respectful and kind and loving as possible, while also being honest about some of the ways that there has been harm done in different interpretations of this particular narrative. Actually seems like there has been some harm that we want to honor and name and see what we can do to find a different ground of understanding with one another. So I'd love to start with Fosia of what would you hope that people see about the character of Hajar from your perspective?
So Hajar for us is a wife of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and she is the mother of a Prophet Ismail alayhi salam, and also she is honored in a way up until this very living day. Till 2025, she is getting honored. So every year at Hajj, about 1 million plus people go. Hajj is the Muslim annual pilgrim in Makkah. And then aside from the Hajj, which takes place in a particular time, we have the Umrah. People can go to Umrah at Makkah any time of the year. And so during the pilgrims, you have these like different steps you perform, and one step is called the sa'i. And in the sa'i is a reflection of what Hajar did when she was left with Ismail. She ran between the two hills, Safa and Marwa, 7 times, and we till this day do it. Anybody who goes to Hajj or Umrah is doing it. And so for us, this is a symbol of the great honor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon Hajar, because when Ibrahim alayhi salam was going to leave her in this desert, she questions him, why are you leaving us? What are you doing? What are we going to do? What do you expect us to, like, how do you expect us to survive? And then she's like, did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask you to do that? And he's like, yes. And so at that point in time, she is like, you know what, if Allah asked you to, Allah does not lose his people. So this is something that is in one of the hadiths. And so she kind of runs between the two hills 7 times. Like, she's not sitting there thinking, oh my God, Ibrahim alayhi salam, you left me. What do I do? I have this baby. What am I going to do with them? Oh, no, no, no. She like runs between the hills to see, like if she can see someone coming, or if she can spot any kind of water source. And the 7th time, the angel Jibreel, he comes down and he strikes the ground where baby Ismail is, and water springs out. And that water well is called Zamzam. And still till this day, it has running water. And every time we go to Hajj or Umrah, we bring like bottlefuls of it and share it with our family and friends. And so for us, I would like people to know the honor that she holds, that until this day, every single Muslim who goes, and I don't know of any woman that is honored in such a way. Like, until this day, anytime you go to Hajj or Umrah, we have to do the sa'i, which is in honor of Hajar alayhi salam.
Rabbi Tamar, when you think about interpretations of Genesis 21 and God's provision of Hagar there, what interpretations come to mind for you as you sit here today and hear Fosia's story?
Yeah, well, so interesting to hear. It's not the first time I've heard that version of Hagar's story, but to hear the way you described it was really powerful, because it just gave her so much agency and so much. It's like such a reframing of what's in the Torah. At the same time, I think there's a lot that when I think about her, I think about being seen and seeing, right? Because there's originally, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to like quickly find the verses, but but take my word for it that the place that she is in is called Be'er Lachai Ro'i, and Be'er means spring, and Lachai Ro'i, you hear Chai in there again that we talked about on the last episode, means life, and Ro'i from the root meaning to see. So there's sort of there's a lot of being seen and seeing, that she sees this spring, and that God sees her. And so I just love that aspect of the story that's in the Torah in light of what Fosia just shared.
Mm-hmm. Then in both traditions, there's a provision of water, there's seeing and being seen, and that is in common with that. What do you notice about that, Rachel, as you think about the Christian interpretation of her narrative?
I'm reading this, looking at this passage again in Galatians. I spent a lot more time with Hagar in Genesis, and actually in the Hadith and Quranic tradition, than I have with her in Galatians. But the way that she's talked about, even the slave language, is it's fraught. That word is a hard word, but in a sense, I feel like, why, and I'm just right now questioning this. Why do we interpret this text as, like, again, blame the woman? It's her fault. How is it her fault that she was a slave? How is it her fault that she was, part of this, like what you said, Steph, in the beginning, of kind of a foil for Abraham's lack of faith? Why do we not blame that on Abraham and put it on Hagar, which then leads down to how we interpret this as a negative thing toward Muslims or Islam as having come out of that line of Hagar and Ishmael. Like, I don't understand. And right now I'm just wrestling with this idea of how did we get to that point? When I look at her story in Genesis and I see the seeing that Rabbi Tamar has talked about, like she sees the water, even what Fosia said, in running between the mountains, she sees this water and God sees her and provides the water. And that's a powerful, beautiful thing. How has my tradition twisted it? I just right now in real time wrestling with that.
Which we, between recordings, I feel like we should maybe pull a little bit forward about what we said as we think about, we're not representing all of a tradition, but particularly then when we're in this Christian tradition, 40 Orchards tends to have a particular lens on how we hold the letters of Paul that gives us a particular bias in these sorts of conversations where we would be really comfortable being frustrated with Paul. And not all parts of the Christian tradition would be comfortable with the frustration that we have towards Paul. And so that is a part of the lens that we are then carrying, is that we feel like it's okay to critique his interpretation of this passage. And it's maybe worth naming that not all Christians would feel as comfortable critiquing his interpretation of this story as we feel in this conversation. But hopefully that bears fruit in this conversation.
I just want to be free to ask the question, whether I end up, not critiquing or unpack, taking down Paul. I don't think I would intend to do that. I want to re-understand it. What is he trying to say? And I don't think we'll get there today, but I'm already pointing to my takeaway.
I think, so this story I have a particular fondness for because it was instrumental in my doing prison work. I had, in one of the first places that I started volunteering inside the prison, I had just read Womanist Midrash, and it allowed me to bring in to a conversation that we were having inside of this small group that I was volunteering inside of. The women had a lot of questions, and it was interesting because it was an interreligious group. We had people with indigenous tradition and faith coming in. Like there was a mix of conversation, and we were finding similarities and different spots. And one of the things that I had shared was that it is a particular of interest that a woman who is, as Reverend Dr. Wilda Gaffney says, is like considered a womb slave, which women could relate to when we're talking about like the not so distant American history of women who were enslaved and forced to bear children, but also in sex trafficking. And so for women who are incarcerated, a lot of them have similar-ish stories. And when you're combining force and ownership of a human, and in particular, it involves sex, whichever way we cut it in terms of what we want to label it. And so it allowed the women in the room to see themselves inside of the story, but also in a way that felt like congruent with some of their experience. And one of the things that I liked to like kind of spotlight was that Hagar actually names God, gives God a name in response. And that is one of the very, very few places that we actually see a human doing that. And like to like acknowledge like how significant that is, and that like you are able to like however you're interacting with God, like that lies on the table for you to have to name your experience. Mm-hmm. And so like in some way, like I shut off whatever that's happening in the Newer Testament. I don't talk much about it. It's never come up in any conversation that I've had. But this particular story in the Older Testament is actually a place of, it's extremely powerful inside of a female prison.
Mm-hmm. I will add, I will pull that forward just one more step into the Christian tradition, because we are recording this in Advent. And I would say in Genesis 16, the language of the angel to Hagar about the prophecy that she will bear a child actually has a lot of similar language to what is said to Mary in the book of Luke. And so I think that parallel is important to name and notice, and has often been not talked about in Christianity the way it should, that there's a very parallel phrasing of the angel visit to Mary. I'm not going to unpack that. I'm just going to name that when you pull forward, it's a little bit different than when you go back. But Fozia, I would love for you to comment on some of the things Lisa said, because you have given Hajar a lot more autonomy and agency than has been true in some of our interpretations and tradition. How much agency did she have in bearing Abraham's child?
So the way we see it, Hajar was given to Sayyida Sarah, who was the first wife of Ibrahim Islam, that when they were traveling in Egypt, and there was that tyrant king that wanted to have his way with Sarah, and she kept making dua that Ya Allah, oh God, protect me, protect me, protect me. And when she was protected, he's like, oh, what is going on with that woman? Every time I try to approach her, I just get paralysis or something. And so after a while, he's just like, I'm not going to have anything to do with her. She's probably some kind of, there's some kind of magic associated with her. I want her gone. And then he gives her the slave, Hajar. And then since the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam at that point in time had no children, it was Sarah who realized the fact that, okay, I mean, she knew that she can have children. And so she was the one who gave Prophet Ibrahim Hajar. And so they had a child through that. So in our tradition and text or anything, there is like no force happening or anything like that. So, I mean, I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the Hebrew Bible, it is also the case that Sarah is the one who, that Hagar is Sarah's maidservant, and she, when she sees that she is not able to have children, she gives Hagar to Avram as and it's interesting, we talked about the language used for her. In the Hebrew, it says, Vatiteno tala Avram isha lo leisha. So his wife gave her to him as a wife. The translation that I have, which is the Jewish Publication Society's translation from 2006, says, and he gave her, and she gave her to her husband Abram as a concubine. But the Hebrew is isha, which means woman, but is really the word used for wife. It's the same word that would be used for Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. As a wife.
Mm-hmm. I think that might be a surprise for people, for listeners to hear, that in the book of Genesis and in the Islamic tradition, both would hold that she became a wife of Abram. And I think the womanist interpretation that Lisa brought forward is a good tension to hold there of how much choice did she have over becoming a wife, according to her position in society. Is the tension that Dr. Wilda Gaffney is bringing forward. And yet we can also see that she is being elevated to the status of a wife. And how does that affect how we see her narrative and her?
She still is called a slave woman later. So it's not like that language isn't there also.
So, in our faith tradition, when Ibrahim alayhi salam is like, okay, I am going to take you to this place where there's no water, no nothing. She's seen as someone who's protesting. She's like, what are you doing? What are we going to do there? I have this small baby, and she is trying to like question him and ask him, like, she's just not like, yeah, because she's questioning him, like, it makes sense, and so when he tells her that, it is Allah's command, that's the time when she's like, okay, if Allah is asking you to do this, then Allah does not lose his people. And that's when her certainty comes in. That's where her faith comes in. That's when her trust comes in. And a big part of our faith tradition is that everybody is going to be tested in this life. Some people's tests are small, some are big, just depending upon the person. And so when we look at these stories of these beautiful women, we look at them from the lens of a test. Okay, what is their test? How are they responding to their test? And so in our faith tradition, when we look at Hajar, we look at her trust in God. We not her trust in her husband Ibrahim alayhi salam, but her trust, her I guess her language and her demeanor changes when it's like, Allah wants me to do this. It's like, if Allah wants you to do this, then He must have a plan for us. And this is something that we see in our everyday lives, with our friends and families and some people like that. If someone is going through a test, we constantly remind ourselves, trust Allah, trust Allah, trust Allah. And so when we look at these stories, we don't look at them in the lens of like, I guess, like what happened, how it happened. We look at it in the lens of like, how can we take a lesson from it and apply it to our lives? Does that?
Yes, well, and I noticed that your narrative was making Rabbi Tamar smile, and so I'm curious about what you were noticing.
Yeah, so like Stephanie, you said on one of the other episodes, like you were feeling this a little bit of, I can't remember how you phrased it, but like sort of like jealousy for the way
holy envy.
Thank you. That's what it was. Yeah, I felt myself feeling a little bit of that, because that trust piece is so beautiful, and it's so important to. I don't love the word faith, but I'm going to use it anyways, to a faith tradition, right? Like it's such an important element of a relationship with the divine. And I think what you see in the Torah is this sort of, Hagar is like, God has pity on her, right? Like she's in this very vulnerable place. She doesn't have enough water. She's worried her son is going to die, and God takes notice of her. And that's parallel with what happens to the Hebrews when they're enslaved in Egypt, right? Like they are in this difficult, place where they're being oppressed, and they cry out, right? Just like Hagar cries out, and God takes notice of them. And so there's just like a thing in Jewish culture about like, well, it's in our lowly places that God, and when we cry out, and then God takes notice of us, and that's kind of the dynamic. It's like, oh, we get to a hard place, we are struggling, we cry out, then God shows up for us. I love, a little holy envy for like this, just like strength of Hagar being like, I trust, I know, like God, and having that sense of like God is protecting me. There's never this concern of feeling abandoned, and then God has to step in. So I just think it's beautiful.
And in both cases, we do see God seeing and God protecting and God helping, and so that commonality seems very important to make sure that we're noticing, because the stories and the narratives are different, but God sees and God provides in both. Were you going to say something, Rachel?
I just love, Rabbi Tamar, how you brought up the connection with the Israelites in Egypt later, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but there's a Hebrew word, anau, that appears in both texts. I'm sure
anau, is that the word?
It's what Sarah does to Hagar, so that Hagar flees. She oppresses her in some way, and it's the same word that. What is it?
It's like inui. I don't know exactly the form that it's in, but
okay, I don't know either. But I'm pretty sure from my study that it's the same word that shows up with what the Egyptians are doing to the Israelites. Like it's the same oppression, and then
afflicted
or flees. Yeah, and what happens after she flees is that God sees her and gives her a promise. And this is what I've been unpacking through. And as I'm trying to tear down those, I think what were lies about the animosity between Christians and Muslims stemming from her story, of where she receives a promise about her son. And you read it in your text, Rabbi Tamar, also in the beginning of this podcast, where God promises to make her son into a mighty nation. Just the same promise that God had given to Sarah and Abraham about Isaac, that Ishmael has that same promise to become a mighty nation. And one of the things that I love about that promise, I think it's in, I can't remember the chapter, maybe 16, Genesis 16, where God says to her, like, how she's going to name her son. And then God says he's going to be a wild ass of a man. And that was the phrase that was reinterpreted in my tradition as a negative thing, that he's going to be this wild donkey and kind of out of control and in animosity with his brothers or neighbors. And then through living where I lived in the Horn of Africa for so long, people want a strong, wild, autonomous, free son. That's a promise, especially to a woman who is a slave woman or a second wife or whatever her context was. It wasn't a negative thing. It'd be a negative thing if you're in a Minnesota suburb, public school, sitting at your desk, needing to be calm and contained. But in that period, in that time, in that context, I imagine it being like, yes, my son's going to be free. We're going to expand, and we're going to have a mighty nation come out of us. And when I read it that way, I feel like that idea of God's promise to Hagar and then through Hagar and Sarah is just so much bigger than only one line. It just expands the story into blessing all the nations, which is what Abraham and Sarah were supposed to do in the beginning anyway, is to be a blessing. So yeah, I'm not sure where that came from, why I'm saying it right now, but it's somehow tied into the conversation about how I'm trying to reframe her story and allow that to then affect how I think about and talk about other faith traditions.
I think, Rachel makes me think of the first time I met you, because we were talking about this passage the first time I met you, and you gave that interpretation of, in Somalia, they would have loved hearing that their child was going to be strong and wild and free, and that to realize how much a cultural lens has affected how we hear words, and to just pause and to say, would another culture, another time period hear these words differently, and how does that affect how I'm seeing a character and their narrative arc?
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's so interesting because Isaac, of all of the, of all of our forebears, is seen as the weakest. And, certainly today when I talk to people in my congregation about Isaac, they're all like, yeah, he was such a wimp, like why didn't he fight back when his dad said, we're going up this mountain and there's no animal they're bringing with them. Like, what does he think is going on? And he lets him, he lays down on the altar, lets his dad almost sacrifice him. There's a lot of critique of Isaac, at least in contemporary understandings of him.
Mm-hmm. Fozia, can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
I've heard multiple times how the women that we've talked about, many of them are so highly elevated, and then a lot of Muslim women have those names like Maryam or Zahra. I have not heard of many Muslim women named Hajar.
It is actually a common name. It is a very common name. It's just that it's probably not so common in America. I just think that sometimes the pronunciation, because it's a very strong Arabic word like Hajar. But in other countries, actually, I have a couple of friends whose daughters are called Hajar. So it's also one of those names that is, and American Muslims tend to name their daughters names that are, it's sad. I wouldn't do that. Like easier names that are easier pronounceable, like Maryam or Sarah. But Hajar is just as popular. But you probably don't hear it as much here, just because people want kids to be in school and easy pronounceable names. But I do have two friends that are daughters are called Hajar.
Okay, thank you.
I also have a question. I'm sorry if it's an uninformed question, but is the name related to the same root as the word for Hajj, or is it a completely different?
I am not aware of that.
Okay.
Of the meaning?
The roots of the word and the meaning and all that, yeah.
Rabbi Tamar, and what would you say the meaning of the word is in Hebrew?
Related, I think, to the root for ger, which means stranger in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. I did have a friend in college on in my dorm in college who was named Hagar, and she was Jewish. She was Israeli. Her parents are Israeli.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, in the book of Exodus, that name becomes associated with Moses and feeling like a stranger. And so there's also some sense of that not necessarily being as negative as it seems, or would you say that differently?
I think it could be seen negatively, but not necessarily. One of the most oft-repeated phrases in the Torah is to love the stranger. So, I think you can see it as negative or not.
Yes.
I'm not sure that it's obvious.
I'm curious as I think about the verse from Galatians, which we've talked about the least in this. Rachel, what you brought forward with the cultural context for understanding wild ass of a man being a different sort of a word in that cultural context. I have been very curious in recent years about reading the words of Paul through a Greek philosophy context. And that at that time period, within the height of sort of a culture that was Greek philosophy, that binary thinking is a primary way you make an argument, which perhaps reads forward a little differently than it was even intended at the time. Is here, and you have two characters where you can make a binary, which in Greek philosophy, if you make a binary, that puts your argument forward. But how difficult it feels when that binary is two humans in a story. But I'm curious about that influence on what Paul is saying or how he's saying it. If there's a philosophical technique being used to create a binary in order to make a point. Again, I can still wonder about how I feel about him using humans as a binary. But I wonder about that cultural context for his words.
I can't speak wisely at all into Greek philosophy or that, but what it makes me think, what you just said, is how if he was just using these people as an argument or, fodder for making an argument, how we have then taken that to apply to entire mass people groups, as opposed to limiting it to the context in which he was using it, which might be one of the tools I take to start rethinking about this passage, or not even rethinking, but just thinking about it to begin with. That's different. Those two things are very different in reading this as in two people from the past as kind of a binary example to set up his argument to make a different point. And then for whatever reason, we have now taken that and just said billions of people. That's what this means, as opposed to these two women.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, you looked like you were about to say something. A moment ago. No, just thinking.
No, just listening, thinking.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, but we also have to transition to closing. So is it a quick question or a long one?
I think it's a quick one.
Okay.
Fosia, have you been on Hajj? And if you have, I would love to hear how you personally connected with this particular aspect of it.
I have been to Hajj. Alhamdulillah, thank God I got the opportunity to go before I had kids, because it's really hard to travel with little ones. And so it was honestly when I was there. So the way I was raised in my faith tradition is to connect these stories of the prophets and women on a personal level. How do you apply them to your real life? And it is hot, right? This is Hajj is no joke. There's like millions and millions of people, and now like times have evolved, and there's so much air conditioning available, and especially going from America, as an American Muslim, you have a certain privilege that Muslims in other parts of the world don't have. And when I was there, I was like, how did she even it's so hot. Like right now they're covered, the two hills, and it's like air conditioning, and the only thing you have to do is like walk in bare feet. And I'm like, when I was there, I just had this moment of like, with a small child in this heat, you're like looking through two hills, and that walk is not easy. And this is me talking, I'm going to say a spoiled American Muslim, walking between those hills in an air-conditioned situation with bare feet, and I was like, this is not easy. And just having that in mind, I just kept thinking, how did she not lose it? She could have just been like, but she was very active. I think, Stephanie, you had used the word in one of our other podcasts, that active effort, that active participation, in terms of the fact that she's like, I am not going to just sit here and complain that, oh, I'm in this bind. She's like, I'm running, trying to see if I can find someone who may be coming this way, or maybe there is some water source that I haven't looked into. So for me, I was in a sense of awe of her. I was like, this amazing woman. I, as a person, as a young, healthy, woman, I just don't want to do this because this is hard. Walking between two hills in an air-conditioned situation with so many people. I'm like, so yeah, it was just all for me.
Rachel, I'm so glad you asked that question because that allowed us to end with this like real life feeling of what it would have been like to look for water in the desert. Because as we sit here in our temperature controlled houses, it's an important imagining of this, of looking for water in the desert is a very big undertaking. Well, so let's end with takeaways, the way that we have done in previous episodes as well, of as we think about this conversation we've had, what is something that you personally, or you would hope our listeners remember or think about or do from this conversation?
I am going to say rely on God. And when you rely on God, be active about it. Have faith that God is going to respond.
Mm-hmm.
I would say look for ways to be compassionate and to understand another person's experience.
I am going to say personally, and for Christians listening, to put Paul and Genesis back together and re-wrestle with what is being taught in those stories.
I don't know that I have a particular pointed takeaway. I really like Hagar, Hajar. I like the invitation to continue to wrestle and see folks who are doing incredible things in the midst of oppression as people we can look towards to tell us how to wrestle better.
Mm-hmm. I'm connecting the short conversation we had about her name, this and Rabbi Tamar, the way you connected it to the call to love the stranger, the way that God was modeling that by seeing and by providing, and whether if we're looking for ways to love the stranger, we've been given an example in God's love for this woman whose name perhaps carries that meaning to it in the Hebrew text that feels meaningful to watch the way that God sees and God provides for the stranger with that interpretation of her name. So thank you so much. This is it always feels like it's not enough time, and often it has a bit of weightiness or riskiness to it. So thank you for the courage to have these conversations. I am certain that people are learning a lot, and curiosity is piqued because that's what's happening for me. So thank you so much, and we hope you can join us next time on Searching the Sacred.
Thank you.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical texts so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.